Now, our next guest is a very distinguished scholar. Dr. Annelle Rodgriguez Sheline is formerly of the U.S. State Department and a research fellow for the Middle East at the Quincy Institute. As I understand it, Dr. Annelle resigned from the state over Gaza. Let's see if that's right and if she stands by it. Dr. Annelle, thank you very much for joining us. Privileged to interview you. There's been so many lies told about Gaza, particularly in Britain and the United States. It's sometimes difficult for people to keep their sanity when they see what they see on their phone and then listen to what they listen to in the mainstream media and from their governments. It is such a parallel universe. It's difficult to know whether you're in a bad dream or whether the liars know that they're lying. I presume that's what led to you walking from the U.S. State Department, is it? Tell us, please.
Yes, I resigned in March of 2024. I was working on human rights under Biden's State Department, and October 7th had happened about 6 months before I resigned. And at first I thought, this is an opportunity. I'm inside the State Department. Maybe I can have an impact. I co-authored a dissent cable. I signed other dissent cables. I tried to be involved in the various efforts to convey how many people inside the State Department were horrified by what the United States was supporting. And after 6 months, it just became clear that there was no changing this policy, that this was coming from the White House. This was something Biden himself was quite committed to, as well as people like Brett McGurk, Jake Sullivan, even people like Samantha Power, the administrator of USAID, who made her whole career calling out genocide and the failure of governments like the United States to do something about it. They were committed to this policy. And so I decided I would go public with my resignation, and I would do it again if I thought it would have an impact. But I mean, unfortunately, it seems like very little or nothing is having any impact to change America's unconditional support for Israel's genocide.
Let me just walk back a minute. When I was your age, the State Department and the British Foreign Office were often alleged to be Arabist, was the phrase that was often used, certainly in Britain, about the Foreign Office. But I've just been reading the memoirs of British Foreign Office Minister, Conservative, Alan Duncan, who said that the Israelis think they control the Foreign Office now, and they probably do. Is it the same in the US? Has the former fondness for the Arab world disappeared from the State Department, as it definitely has the British Foreign Office?
I couldn't speak to the degree to which the State Department had a particular fondness for the Arab world. I do think that may be something that may be more particular to the British context, which had such extensive involvement in the Middle East, whereas for the United States, America's connection or sort of extent of a massive military presence in the Middle East goes back about as long as the establishment of the State of Israel. And so in addition to sort of the somewhat tired justification that America maintains a presence in the Middle East for oil, much of it is and has long been about supporting Israel. And that does reflect the power of the Israel lobby, as well as the political influence of Christian Zionists.
Well, that power is being demonstrated all over again, isn't it? Joe Biden's love affair with Israel was such that he once said in the Senate that if Israel didn't exist, America would have to invent it. And he spent his whole career as a shill for the Zionist movements, the American Israel lobby, and so on. But the man that was campaigning until the last minute in the state of Michigan, promising that he would be a peace president if elected. The man who told the people in Dearborn, Michigan, friends of mine who met him and were told by him that there would be a big change and that he would end the war in Gaza. That turned out to be a crock, as you say in the United States. So that vice-like grip that the Israel lobby has on both parties is being demonstrated all over again, isn't it?
It's true. I think initially there was some excitement with the fact that Trump came in and immediately imposed a ceasefire, which simply demonstrated that Biden had never actually used any American leverage, even though the line had always been, we are working tirelessly towards a ceasefire. Clearly, Trump demonstrated before he even came into office that that was not the case. And I think initially there was some optimism because of the fact that Trump did impose the ceasefire, although he did not require Netanyahu to stick to it. It was violated routinely during phase one. And then, as people know, it never reached phase two. And Israel hasn't allowed actual aid into Gaza since March 2nd. But Trump did do certain things that went against the preferences of Netanyahu and the Israeli government. Things like signing the ceasefire deal with the Houthis and getting the U.S. out of what was becoming a debacle of jets falling off aircraft carriers and just billions of dollars. I believe it had already been $2 billion that the Biden administration had spent on that campaign, and that even within just a matter of weeks, Trump had spent another $1 billion. And so ending that, normalizing relations with Syria, for example, that wasn't something that initially it seemed that Netanyahu was as in favor of. And then initiating direct negotiations with the Iranians over their nuclear program. So I think there had been some initial optimism that maybe Trump was willing to establish a foreign policy in the Middle East that was more dictated by American interests to a certain extent, although he was never willing to go against Netanyahu on Gaza, clearly, and has been fully supportive of the genocide and has sent additional hundreds of millions of dollars in security assistance and other forms of support. And then clearly, as we all observed, this perhaps facade of Trump sort of diverging from Netanyahu came crashing down when Netanyahu successfully got Trump to drop bombs on Iran. I'm somewhat concerned about what's going to come out of this meeting tomorrow with Netanyahu coming back to Washington. My understanding from Israeli media is Netanyahu may be asking Trump to greenlight more attacks on Iran. There's been some rumors about the possibility of Syria perhaps normalizing relations with Israel, which I think would probably just be a demonstration of how weak al-Shara is as a president. There's also been rumors of an actual ceasefire finally in Gaza, but we know that Netanyahu will violate it at will and has been adamant about retaining the right to again break the ceasefire and start to reinitiate the genocide, which will continue as long as he does not allow actual aid in. It matters whether or not he's firing, but there are babies without baby formula. People are starving to death. And the Gaza Humanitarian Fund is making a mockery of what aid is supposed to be. I mean, it's a means of killing Palestinians more than it's a means of saving them or providing them with assistance.
We'll come back to Gaza, I promise you, because I want to ask you particularly about the GHF. But as I'm pretty sure that Netanyahu is coming to Washington, not for photo calls or backslapping, although Donald said he would be having a bit of a celebration with them. I'm pretty sure that it is Iran related. And I've been reading today that the Israeli attacks on Iran were 1 whole year in the making, 12 whole months. Which means that Donald Trump was negotiating with Iran on an entirely false prospectus. He was leading the Iranians to believe that the standoff could be resolved through negotiations, whilst his closest ally was at an advanced level in a plan for a murderous blitzkrieg against them. I'm not sure why anyone would trust the American government now in any negotiations if that turns out to be true.
Exactly. I do think that it is not entirely clear when it was that Trump decided that he was going to greenlight Israel's actions. We know that at a certain point, Trump was lying to the Iranians, but it's not quite clear when that started. I do think that initially Trump has this idea in his head that he is the deal maker in chief. He has yet to negotiate an end to the war in Ukraine. He has yet to negotiate an end to the genocide in Gaza. And he seemed to think that he was going to be able to get a quick nuclear deal with the Iranians. As he said, he wanted something longer, stronger, better than the JCPOA that he walked out of in 2018. My understanding is what happened was initially the American negotiating position was something, it was achieving progress. However, it was when the Americans adopted the Israeli talking point of zero enrichment, which Iran is permitted to enrich uranium for civilian purposes, for its own purposes, because it is a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But the Israeli talking point and then the American talking point was Iran cannot enrich any uranium, which is a red line for the Iranian government. So as soon as the US negotiating team had adopted that position, negotiations stalled. Trump is not patient. The Israelis said, let us bomb them a little. This will soften them up. And Trump gave it the green light, including by sending 300 Hellfire missiles to Israel to use on Iran ahead of their attack on June 13th. So again, the question of when was it that Trump decided the negotiations weren't working? Was that his plan from the beginning, or was there a point at which he became frustrated and decided he was going to maintain the false premise that they were going to be meeting to negotiate in Oman that weekend? And instead, he'd already told Netanyahu to go for it. I think another crucial point is we saw statements initially coming out of the State Department, coming out of the Pentagon, that the United States was not involved in Israel's bombing. But then Trump saw how well the bombing was playing on Fox News and felt he wanted to be a part of this and suddenly wanted some of this glory for himself, and then started to indicate, well, maybe we were involved. And obviously the United States is involved in everything Israel does militarily because we provide the vast majority of their weapons, and much of it we just give them as well as selling them. So then the fact that we did see Trump dropping bombs on Iran was, the only reason I have any optimism about any of this is the fact that we did see very significant pushback, in contrast to something like the lead up to the Iraq War, where the vast majority of the country was still had a bloodlust from 9/11 and had been sold this narrative that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and that somehow Iraq was involved in 9/11, which obviously is completely false. But there was this notion that we have to go after those people. And there was a lot of support for the Iraq war. Whereas I think I don't trust that Trump wouldn't have continued to fight this war because, as you said, he campaigned on this idea of no new wars, no more forever wars, and yet was led almost into yet another forever war because of the influence of Israel. But I was heartened to see even people like Marjorie Taylor Greene being very public in calling for no new wars. The fact that Thomas Massey, a Republican, and Ro Khanna, a Democrat, had introduced a war powers resolution in the House, and Tim Kaine, a senator, had introduced the companion bill in the Senate. So my hope is that if this is what Netanyahu is asking for tomorrow, is let's hit the Iranians again, that Trump would understand that there is a cost to pay for this, that his constituent, the many Americans believed him when he said, no more wars. And that's why a lot of people voted for him. And that's also why a lot of people didn't vote for Harris, is because she had said she was in favor of Biden's foreign policy. And that's why we saw such a decline in turnout, massive turnout for Biden in 2020. And 29% of the voters who didn't vote for Harris after voting for Biden cited their main issue was Gaza, because they knew that Harris wasn't going to do anything different on Gaza.
My goodness, you're good. Will you allow me one more question, Doctor? It's a slightly, maybe deeper one, if I may say so. I keep waiting for, I see journalists murdered by the hundred. And I saw in a cafe, to call it a cafe is a misnomer, but it's where journalists went to charge their phones and get some internet and file their stories and so on, which was full not just of journalists but of women and children mainly. I saw it destroyed and the river of blood that it set forth into the Mediterranean on the beach, a beach I know well, just the other day. I keep wondering, when will, and I saw the head of the Indonesian hospital in Gaza, a hospital of some moment. My wife is Indonesian, murdered. I see another doctor with his wife and all of his children murdered in a tent overnight in Gaza. I keep asking myself, when will the journalists, when will the doctors, when will the feminists, when will the pro-life lobby that cares so much about unborn children but nothing about children already born and dying in infancy in Gaza, when will all these different sectors of our population say enough is enough? I'm not singling America out. I have exactly the same question here in Britain. Whenever that point is, it certainly hasn't been reached yet, has it?
No, I ask myself the same question. I think a big part of it is the way that Israel has gone about this genocide has been cumulative. People may remember that very first hospital that was hit, I believe, on October 17th. And there was this whole narrative that it was a misfired Hamas rocket. Israel would never strike a hospital, being the implication. And then they learned that that didn't get a big reaction. Now we're going to hit a hospital. Now we're going to, and remember, there was all I remember right around the time that I resigned was when the World Central Kitchen humanitarian workers were killed. That got a lot of attention. But then it all just starts to become so normalized. And I think at this point, so many people just feel such despair. And it is from the perspective of the mainstream media, they're not reporting on it anymore. It's just it's just normal that Palestinians are so dehumanized that it simply no longer registers. And so I think that is part of why we continue to see people not calling this out, because it has kind of over time grown to sort of such a scale that I think people can no longer process it, and they do feel very disempowered. At the same time, I do take some heart from the fact that certain people who once defended this, I mean, figures like Piers Morgan, for example, who had long defended this, coming out against it, seeing the performers at Glastonbury and all the attention that got. I also want to draw attention to the fact that there had been a UN conference that was going to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia that was scheduled to happen in New York, which was postponed by Israel's attack, and to my knowledge has not yet been rescheduled. It might correspond to the UN General Assembly in September. But that was about the question of Palestine. And the idea was to coalesce a global coalition to do something, not only about the genocide, but also just the fact that Israel has been violating international law with total impunity for decades. And although the countries of the UN have voted multiple times to try to impose some accountability, it has not yet worked. And so it's unclear what's going to happen with that conference. But in the meantime, the Hague Group, which is a group that is co-chaired by South Africa and Colombia, as well as several other countries from the global south, Cuba, Honduras, Malaysia, a few others, are meeting in Bogota in this next week and are trying to impose some kind of accountability. And Francesca Albanese, the special rapporteur, the UN special rapporteur for the occupied territories of Palestine, is calling for all countries to participate, to impose some degree of consequences on Israel. Although obviously, as long as the United States continues to support Israel and as long as the EU remains its major trading partner, it's going to be difficult to actually impose real consequences. But other countries can begin to even just take small and symbolic measures. This was how global condemnation of South Africa, of apartheid South Africa, began. Was not from the United States, was not from the UK, but it was from the rest of the world that understood that if countries are allowed to violate international law with such impunity, it's not just a moral stain and it's not just horrifying for the people who are subjected to that, but this undermines the fabric of international law for all of us. Now it's Israel. Who's it going to be in the future when it could be you and me being subjected to a country that is tearing apart the fabric of our society, that is committing genocide against us because the world did not come together to say this is unacceptable and Israel, you are not allowed to do this and no country is allowed to do this. So I very much hope that other countries will be participating in this meeting in Bogota, and that we will continue to see more and more countries, people and countries or individuals who once defended or were once quiet about what Israel is doing, who say enough is enough.